All right, Instagram. We're just letting YouTube warm up here. Hey, YouTube. All right, we got everyone here. We're talking about the new study coming out of the Centers for You Know What about how juicing is 5 times or supposedly 5 times more effective than immunity from natural infection or natural immunity. And we're going to talk about why that's not the case, that it showed that. It showed something wildly different than that. But we're just going to let Twitter know and Telegram know that we're live on YouTube. So all right, we're posting this on Twitter. And let's get Telegram. Posting it on Telegram. Okay, those guys are good. And if you're on Instagram, or let me just make sure Facebook is working. All right, it looks like Facebook is working. Okay, good. And if you're on Facebook or you're on Instagram, just know that on YouTube is where you'll get to see screen share. You don't really need screen share today because there's no graphs or anything like that. But it will be perhaps easier for some of you to follow along with the screen share if you're the type of person that likes screen share. And so I'm just going to share my screen on YouTube. All right. And yeah, okay. So this study that, I should just say that, first of all, if you find this of value, please like, share, and subscribe. And of course, if you can go to chrismasterjohnphd.com/support or chrismasterjohnphd.com/donate, I'd appreciate anything you send my way. And the link to the written article that we are talking about, I just finished writing the article, and that is, it is now in my profile link on all my profiles. It's also the most recent post in social media. And you can also go to my website. Let me make sure this is true. So you should be able to go to my website, click on Learn, click on C-word updates, click on read all the published articles here. And no, that doesn't give it to you. Okay, I gotta fix that, but I'll fix it later. All right, so the link to the article is in my profile. It's also the most recently shared post across all my social media. Disclaimer, I'm not a medical doctor. This is not medical advice. And I'm not taking any position on whether you should get juiced or not. Please make that decision yourself, consulting sources you trust, including a caring healthcare professional. I'm just here to show you the data. Okay, so if you recall, in my October 23rd review of the immunity to infection provided by the juice versus having previously been infected by the virus, I found 9 studies that directly compared the infection risk between unjuiced but previously infected people versus fully juiced but never infected people. The conclusion was that across these studies, natural immunity is equal to or superior to full juicing, and in some contexts is wildly superior. Okay. Now, to reduce wordiness in general throughout my article and through this video, well, I use different words in the article. The article is uncensored. The videos, due to my imminent deplatforming from Instagram, are censored. So to reduce wordiness, in most cases, I'm just going to refer to the people who have been fully juiced and never infected as juiced, and the unjuiced people that have previously been infected as natural. I got to use a censored version. I'm going to call them natural. Okay. So we've got the fully juiced people that have never been infected are just the juiced from now on. And we're not dealing with partially juiced people. We are not dealing with natural granola hippies. So it's very clear what we mean. We mean by juiced, we mean fully juiced, not partially juiced, and never having been infected. And by natural, we mean having been infected naturally, but never having been juiced. And so we're just going to call them juiced and natural. Okay. So the review of the 9 studies showed that, as I just said a minute ago, that across those studies, the natural is equal to or superior to the juice, and in some contexts, wildly superior. So there was an Israeli study in particularly under the Delta dominant conditions, when you controlled for the week in which someone was juiced or infected, and this is in the whole population, and so the age distribution is skewed young compared to some other studies. The average age of the people in the study was 33 in one analysis and 36 in another. And so it differs from a United States study where they were studying veterans in a very similar manner, but everyone was much older. But the Israeli study showed that the natural was 13 times more effective against infection, was 27 times more effective against being a symptomatic case, and was 7 times more effective against being hospitalized. And so that's what I mean by wildly superior. Okay. So within a week of my review, 6 days later, and this was a few days ago by now, because I haven't had a chance to analyze it until today, what many people are calling a Centers for You Know What paper, claiming that juicing is 5 times more protective than the natural, concluded that all eligible persons should be juiced against the C word as soon as possible, including unjuiced persons previously infected with the virus. Okay, so this isn't really published. I wouldn't really call it. I put Centers for You Know What in quotes in my article because it's not really like institutionally produced by the Centers for You Know What. It is published in the Centers for You Know What's journal, Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, or MMWR, and several of the authors are affiliated with the Centers for You Know What C-word response team. But many of the authors are affiliated with pharmaceutical companies such as Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Merck, and GlaxoSmithKline. And so it's really best described as a collaboration between some authors from the Centers for You Know What, major pharmaceutical and healthcare companies, hospitals, and medical schools that was published in the Center for You Know What's journal. I would note that MMWR is not peer-reviewed. The Centers for You Know What says that the editors review each article to ensure the content comports with Centers for You Know What policy. So it has, so in my words, it's undergone more review than a preprint has, which hasn't been reviewed by anyone yet, but is destined for peer review. But it hasn't been reviewed for scientific rigor in the way that a peer-reviewed paper in a regular science journal would be. And so it's somewhere between a preprint and a fully published science paper if it's published in MMWR, in my view. Okay, so first of all, this new study doesn't fit the criteria for my earlier review. My earlier review was looking at, number one, it had to look at infection risk, not any surrogate markers. And number two, it had to directly compare juiced versus natural from representative samples of their respective populations. In other words, a representative sample of everyone who had been juiced or a representative sample of everyone who is natural. That's not what this study does. This study starts with people who have already been hospitalized for COVID-like illness and then makes the comparison between juiced and natural within that number of people who are all hospitalized. Okay, this is a rather bizarre design because presumably our interest in the relative risk of getting the C word is that we want fewer people to be hospitalized with respiratory failure or other severe symptoms. But if everyone in the study is hospitalized with those symptoms, does it really matter whether their nose test is positive or negative? Now, this study does suggest that juicing makes people more likely to be hospitalized with a negative nose test rather than a positive one, but it doesn't support juicing making people any less likely to wind up in the hospital. And so that's what's particularly crazy about this study is that we've been bombarded with the public messaging that if, maybe juice doesn't protect against transmission, maybe juice doesn't do this or that, maybe whatever, but at least it'll keep you out of the hospital. that's what we've been hearing everywhere, right? Okay. So it's a rather bizarre study design from that perspective. Like, how much do we even care whether the nose test is positive or negative? So it doesn't even fit in the category of those 9 studies. There's still only 9 studies that fit my criteria. This doesn't change anything, and it can't change the conclusions of my earlier review. But it's still interesting to look at. And so let's look at what it shows. So first of all, who did they study? They studied adults who were hospitalized in 2021 with respiratory failure, pneumonia, cough, fever, dyspnea, which is difficulty breathing, vomiting, or diarrhea. Okay, that's what everyone had. Everyone had one of those things or more. And they had to have at least one nose test, and it could be either of the major types of nose tests, the one you can buy in the drugstore, the one you have to go to the hospital for or get mailed to you in a kit. They had to have one of those prior to the hospitalization, at least 2 weeks before. And in fact, ultimately in the data they actually used, it had to be at least 90 days old. And then they also had to have at least one nose test, not the rapid one that you can get in the drugstore, but the you know what I'm talking about. That had to be done in the 2 weeks leading up to admission or in the 3 days after they were admitted to the hospital. So the data came from 187 hospitals across 9 states, and partially juiced people, those who got the Mr. Johnson juice instead of the Mr. Fuzzy juice or the Aztec juice, and those whose juicing or previous infection occurred less than 90 days, all of those people are excluded. So the study is asking the following question. Among those hospitalized with C-word-like symptoms, which event from more than 90 days in the past is more effective at reducing the probability of a positive nose test? The natural or being fully juiced with messenger ribonucleic acid juices? Between January 1st and September 2nd, 2021, there were 201,269 people who were hospitalized with C-word-like illness. 2/3 of these people were tested for the C-word, and just under 8% of them also had a previous test from the earlier period. So among over 200,000 people who were hospitalized, 7,348 people had 2 tests from the appropriate time periods and fit into one of the 2 categories, juiced or natural. Okay, now, before we get to the findings that these authors wanted to talk about, I want to talk about the findings that I want to talk about that they didn't talk about at all. There were 6 times more fully juiced hospitalized patients. Now, this study was not designed to look at the rate of winding up in the hospital in either juiced or natural. We don't have a denominator from the general population of juiced people or a denominator for the general population of natural people. And so we can't actually say what the rate of becoming hospitalized was. However, and they also don't tell us what the rate of juicing was in the 200,000 plus people. They don't tell us anything about that cohort. They just narrow it down to these 7,000 people. Okay. But if the rate of juicing in the 200,000 plus cohort looks anything like this subgroup who had the 2 tests at the right time periods, then it should be deeply concerning that there were 6,328 juiced and 1,020 natural people who were hospitalized for C-word-like illness. Okay, there were more than so. This is everyone in 187 hospitals in 9 states. It's everyone who fulfills the criteria of having 2 tests and fitting into one of those categories. All right. And so, although it's not a random sample of those populations from which they came, it's basically representing everyone in the hospital, presuming that there's no reason that whether they had a previous test or not would somehow bias whether they were juiced or not. And so they could have reported it, but they didn't. generally if they don't report something, it's probably because they didn't like the way it looked. And given that their conclusions, remember, their conclusion is that everyone must get juiced ASAP, no matter what. Everyone. That's their conclusion from this paper, which is so laughable once we go through it. But even now, it's, we would like to know, out of the 200,000 people, did that rate of juicing look anything like it does here? Because here there are more than 6 times as many fully juiced people in the hospital for C word like illness as natural people. So that seems to make you wonder. It's not designed to ask this question, but it seems to make you wonder, does juicing make people 6 times more likely to wind up in the hospital with C word like illness? At a minimum, it suggests that when we see data about people who are hospitalized with the C word, we're missing a much larger fraction of the people hospitalized with nose test negative C word like illness. Now, this concern is reminiscent about a point that the BMJ, British Medical Journal's Peter Doshi, had made when he pointed out that the FD you know what review of the Mr. Fuzzy data at the 2-month point, when they gave the EUA for the juice in December 2020, showed that nose test positive actual C word was only 5% of all C word like illness. And the juice appeared to have no effect on the total C word like illness. So I looked at the relevant section in that 2-month follow-up, and there were only 2 cases of suspected C word that were serious, and both were in the juice group. Now, I imagine that the 6-month follow-up, there are more serious cases of the suspected C word like illness. But to my knowledge, because the FD you know what did not convene the voting panel, there is no such briefing that describes the data for us. If that's not, I don't know that that's true, but it's true to the best of my knowledge. And so they have this data from the clinical trials, but they haven't published it. We don't know the rate of C word like illness in these trials, but it's probably 20 times the rate of actual C word from a positive nose test. And probably the only way we'll ever see it is if lawyers in lawsuits get it subpoenaed. That's my prediction. And I believe that lawyers in lawsuits should make a very, very explicit and specific and strategic attempt to subpoena that data. We need to see that data. So it may or may not be the case that the 6-month follow-up data, and when I say 6 months, it was actually most of the people were followed up for 3 or 4 months, but officially the paper is the 6-month follow-up. So it may or may not be the case that the clinical trial data basically support this idea that that only 5% of C word like illness test positive, and the juice is either doing nothing to it or maybe making it worse. So we can't really conclude anything from this because of the design of the study, but it looks suspicious that there's 6 times more of it. Now, and remember, I mean, what are we talking about? C word like illness. What are we talking about? We're talking about these people have respiratory failure. They have pneumonia. They have trouble breathing. They have fever. They have cough. They have diarrhea. They have vomiting. These people are really sick and they're hospitalized. So we're not talking about, they filled out a questionnaire and they had similar mild symptoms. We're talking about they're hospitalized for serious cases of something that looks just like the C word, but maybe it doesn't test positive in 95% of cases. Okay. So moving on, the main results of this study. So among the 6,328 juiced patients, 5.1% tested positive. Among the 1,020 naturally immune patients, 8.7% tested positive. One way to look at this is that the naturally immune patients were 71% more likely to test positive than the vaccinated, than the juiced patients. We'll see if the algos pick that up. All right, it's live. I can't do anything about it. Okay, feel like I'm feel like I said the F word and it didn't get bleeped out on live TV back in the day. Anyway, Okay, so another way to look at this is that they don't, this is my way of looking at it. Another way to look at this is that 94.4% of all C-word-like illness was nose test negative. This is very similar to what Doshi dug up from the FD You Know What's review of the 2-month Mr. Fuzzy data. Only in this case, everyone's hospitalized. And remember, they're hospitalized from respiratory failure, pneumonia, cough, fever, difficulty breathing, vomiting, and diarrhea. So the biggest news from this should be that hospitalization with these symptoms, if the nose test is worth its salt, generally is not driven by the C word, right? 95% of the serious cases test negative. Across 187 hospitals in 9 states. How is that not the biggest news from this study? That most serious cases of respiratory failure, trouble breathing, and pneumonia in the hospitals test negative. How is that not the biggest news of this study? Anyway, okay. So when they statistically adjusted for age, geographic region, calendar time, and local virus circulation, the natural patients had 5.5 greater odds of testing positive than the juiced patients. And that was the headline. All right. The fully adjusted data about testing positive was the headline. And that was the only thing that was the headline. It wasn't just the headline of the article. It was the headline in the New York Times. It was the headline of every syndicated piece of propaganda coming straight out of the Ministry of Propaganda's official journal. Okay. And that's meaningful. It's meaningful to know that. But it's not the only piece of news from this study. Okay. So when you adjust for, and remember, if you're talking about mandates, you don't want the adjusted figures. You want, in a random sample of people, who are the clean people and who are the dirty people. So you don't adjust the figures. But these unadjusted data are worthless because everyone's in the hospital, right? No one in the bouncer's not going around to the hospitalized patients and being like, you can't get in for dinner tonight, you know? So this paper has got no relevance to mandates whatsoever. And so you do want the fully adjusted data to get a sense of the biological causation, because when you're controlling for the fact that older people might have gotten juiced first and people where things were worse might have gotten juiced first, et cetera, you want to know those things when you're trying to get a sense of biologically what's happening. So biologically, the juice is doing something to cause a negative test that is probably closer to the 5.5-fold effect than to the 70% relative effect. That's my opinion. It's just that it's either not impacting whether you wound up in the hospital or it's making you 6 times more likely to be in the hospital. And so who cares about the test? But I do think that biologically, it's the adjusted figures are what you want to look at. There's a 5-fold relative odds in the likelihood of testing positive. That favors being juiced versus naturally immune. Again, doesn't matter if you have respiratory failure, what the test said, but I digress. So back to the main results. So this was overwhelmingly driven by the over 65 crowd. When they separated the older people from the younger people, the adjusted odds for natural immunity versus juicing in the over 65 patients went up to 19.6, and in the younger crowd down to 2.6. So if there's a biological effect, it's mostly in the older people. Although they captured juicings and naturals from the same broad period of time, as with most of the other studies, the juicings were still more recent. So 75% were in July or August, and 96% were at least as recent as June. By contrast, for the naturals, 69% were in May or earlier, and 87% were at least as old as June, right? So with the juicings, it's 96% are June forward, more recent. And with the naturals, it's 87% were June and backward, more older. This trend is also reflected in the number of days between the first immunity event and the hospitalization. So more than twice as many naturals were 150 to 180 days old, and 47% more juicings were less than 120 days old. So nevertheless, they did control for that in one of their statistical models. And although it seemed to reduce the odds down from 5.5 to 4.0, it wasn't statistically significant. So even though what I just said is true, that difference in recency, it seems to have a very modest effect on the magnitude of difference that is not statistically distinguishable from chance in this particular study. Similarly, the modern juice seemed more effective than the Mr. Fuzzy juice, but the difference wasn't significant. And surprisingly to me, I would have expected the opposite, but I would have been wrong. It was actually a somewhat stronger effect in the Delta dominant period than before Delta, although that difference also is not statistically significant. Okay, so what do we conclude from this? Go over my conclusions, and I'll go to the live chat. So this study suggests that juicing is more effective than the natural at reducing the likelihood of a positive nose test among people who are all hospitalized for the same reason, and that this is driven mainly by an effect in the over 65 crowd. What does it not tell us? It doesn't tell us anything about the likelihood of testing positive in general, or the likelihood of being hospitalized for these symptoms. In fact, it raises the question of whether the juices may be increasing the likelihood of winding up in the hospital for respiratory failure, pneumonia, cough, fever, difficulty breathing, vomiting, or diarrhea. However, it wasn't designed to ask that question, so we can't make any clear conclusions from it. Because the study has no non-hospitalized patients in its denominator, it's not taken from the sample of people who got the juice and the sample of people who are immune. It's taken from the sample of people in the hospital. So because this study has no non-hospitalized people in the denominators, it doesn't even tell us the risk of winding up as a nose test positive hospitalized case. If they, the only way it could tell us that is if they want us to assume that the denominators would be proportional, such that just because in this study, the natural people had a 70% greater risk of nose testing positive than the juiced people, that also from a random sample of natural and juiced people in the general population, it would also be the case that 70% of more of the naturals would go on to become a positive case in the hospital. If we're going to assume that, then we should also assume that the denominators are the same for the juicing versus natural people who are in the hospital, in which case we would assume that the juice makes people 6 times more likely to wind up as a hospitalized for C-word-like illness that doesn't necessarily test positive. So you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't have your juice and drink it too. If we're gonna assume that these relative proportions, if we're just gonna assume out of thin air that they'll be the same if we're prospectively looking at the general juiced versus natural population going forward to who becomes hospitalized, then we should do the same exact thing for C-word-like illness, in which case the juicing makes it 6 times more likely that you will wind up in the hospital with C-word-like illness. We can't make that assumption for either of those cases. But if we're going to make it for one, we should make it for the other. Okay. So this paper doesn't contradict anything from the conclusions of the 9 studies that I reviewed earlier. These studies continue to show that the natural is equal to or superior to full juicing at protecting against infection risk. And in some contexts, it is wildly superior. And the same thing goes for the risk of serious illness and hospitalization. So that's my conclusion. It just doesn't make any difference now. We just know that there's this strange effect we need to explain on testing positive versus winding up in the hospital for those symptoms. And so my conclusion is totally different than what the authors concluded, which is all eligible persons should be juiced against the C word as soon as possible. All of them, including everyone, all the children right now, including unjuiced persons previously infected with the virus. I find this on its own, I find this totally incomprehensible. But I find it completely comprehensible when I look at the conflict of interest statement, showing that many of the authors are affiliated with Big Pharma. That's the only thing that makes that conclusion comprehensible. The data from the 9 relevant studies to the question show that immune people might benefit, maybe, from hybrid immunity, but we don't know for sure. But they certainly don't need to be juiced in order to have the same or better immunity as the fully juiced, never infected people. Okay, to conclude, before I go to the live chat for questions, I want to read the significant statement in this paper. It is so utterly laughable. Okay, what is already summary? What is already known about this topic? Previous infection with the virus or C word juicing can provide immunity and protection against subsequent infection and illness by this virus. That is not what was previously known. What was previously known was that when you compare the juicing to the natural, the natural is equal to or superior to, and in some contexts, wildly superior to juicing. That was what was previously known. Not just that they both offer some protection. They're what is already known about this topic. They state it like we knew they were both protective, but no one ever bothered to quantify it. So now we have to compare them. Like we're the first people to do it. Are you kidding? This is blatantly, utterly, totally ludicrous statement about what is already known about this topic. Okay, what is added by this report? Well, I told you what's added by this report. And so they focus exclusively on the 5.5-fold adjusted odds, greater odds of testing positive if you're natural versus juiced. And of course, all the other things I said about all the other findings, they leave out of that part. What are the implications for public health practice? I already read you this part, but I'm going to read it again. So now that we know that there are 6 times more juiced people who are hospitalized for respiratory failure, trouble breathing, pneumonia, and other C word-like symptoms. Now that we know there's 6 times more of them are juiced, but the naturals are 70% more likely to test positive. And when you adjust for confounding factors, they're 5.5 times more likely to test positive. Now that we know that, the conclusion is every last person, their brother, their mother, and all their children must be juiced as soon as possible, including all the people who have the natural. That conclusion is so absurd. And then the other funny thing is that in their discussion is so ridiculous. So they say, I'm going to keyword search for conflict. No, that's not the right word. I'm going to keyword search for Israel. Okay. These findings are consistent with evidence that neutralizing antibody titers after receipt of 2 doses of messenger juice are high. They don't say higher than what or anything like that. They just say are high. However, these findings differ from those of a retrospective records-based cohort study in Israel. Of A, right? What does A mean? The singular article A study in Israel suggests that there was one other study on this topic, which did not find higher protection for juiced adults compared to those with previous infection during a period of Delta variant circulation. What? The Delta Israel study is the one that found 13-fold superiority against infection for natural, 27-fold superiority for symptomatic cases, and 7-fold superiority for hospitalizations for the natural. So they said This conflicts with one other study that was done in Israel during Delta, in which they did not find that the juicing was more effective. What? That's the existing body of literature? Are you kidding me? What? All right. So that's it. All right. I said enough. I'm going to go to the questions now. I'll go to Instagram and then I'll go to YouTube and then I'll go to Facebook. All right. I really wish Instagram would separate the people who joined. And I'm waving at everyone who joined. I can't hit all the buttons. EL Taker says your information is gold. Thank you for taking on this fight. You're welcome. It is my pleasure and my duty. VB308 says the nose tests are 97% false positives. I don't know where you got that from. If you do it by so-called culturable virus, it's more like a 50% false positive. But if you're talking about symptomatic or severity or something, then that it might be closer to that, but it's not 97%. Dr. Bernard Fregomeni says exactly why I asked you to review and make sure I wasn't seeing this wrong. Thanks, Chris. You were not seeing this wrong. It might be hard to believe your eyes when you think that the CD, you know what, is anything other than the Ministry of Propaganda at this point. That's the only thing. The only thing that you can conclude, you can't make any sense out of it unless you regard it as a deliberate piece of propaganda to spread things that are obviously incomprehensibly misleading in order to achieve some behavioral goal. It's not comprehensible outside of that context. Caramel Jones says there's no point in this study. Chloe, my vegan friend, says test numbers and hospital records have always been and always will be what is convenient for them. They are manipulating the numbers. This is very reminiscent of when the CD, you know what, just said, well, we're not going to count the denominator of breakthroughs anymore. We're just going to wait till they go to the hospital. For some reason, they like to just limit it to the hospital. Chillwaver 182 says, so this study is essentially propaganda. Only objective is to produce a headline to steer public opinion. Why does this piss poor science get validated and supported by all the top health authorities? Because all the top health authorities are in on it. You can't, there's no other, I have no words for how this could come to be otherwise. Chloe says they're counting on low info people just accepting without looking at the past studies. Yeah, low info people like the New York Times. They're counting on the people who have been doing nothing but writing about this, just carrying the torch, who should know better and just take the BS and run with it because it achieves their goals too. She says, notice they released it right before the election conveniently. If I wanted to be a real egomaniac, I would say, notice they released it right after I came out with my review. I think that the timing, I doubt it's related to the election so much as it is just to it's probably more likely to, in my opinion, it's probably more likely to reflect the fact that the natural immunity was growing, like the campaign to say, hey, acknowledge natural immunity was growing. And as the mandates have expanded, it's been an special point of hypocrisy to point to the obvious fact that this is about obedience and not public health if you don't exempt natural infection. And even the New York Times had a ridiculously atrocious article that said it's time to recognize hybrid immunity, and that all the data suggests that naturally immune people only need one glass of juice and not two. And that article was was it was written as if it was from the Ministry of Propaganda to say, hey, wait a second, we got to act like we acknowledge the importance of the natural so that we don't look like juice propagandists. And yet it was done in a way that would create the perception of that acknowledgement while being a piece of juice propaganda, because that's not what that's not what the data say. But you know, Centers for Propaganda Control, for Centers for Disinformation Control, might have been saying like, well, hey, New York Times feels the need to to pacify the natural crowd and give a nod to this. It's time to really step our game up. It might have been on that order of things. Dr. Bernard Frigomeni says, this study should be the bellwether as to why we need to stop the juice and maintain a control group. I've never seen such a widespread dissemination of misinformation get fivefold BS. I mean, they're obviously, the whole global alignment is to do the opposite of that and make sure there's no control group. People are saying half of Israel is dead. What are you guys talking about? Half the people in Israel died? That can't possibly be true. Keto Dave says, getting a new Oura ring. Unfortunately, I just got an Oura ring before the new model, so not unless they give it to me for free. VB308 says, court on Portugal ruled on the nose test and Centers for Disinformation Control have removed it. Calming now, too many false positives. Oh, that's interesting. I'm not familiar with that story, but that's cool. Jen M. Saunders says, maybe the hospitalized people with the negative test are sick from the juice. Maybe. Scott Trahan says, can you conclude the PCR test is useless? I wouldn't say that. It's useful for something. But remember, this isn't done from a random sample of the population. So we don't really know the rates coming from the population. So it's not really a test of the diagnostic capacity, but it's certainly a hint at its inability to filter out the people who need to be hospitalized. Dr. Bernard Frigomeni says, continued negative tests of double poked later symptomatic will blame flu, COVID-like new variant, autoimmune bomb, and ADE. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what's underlying the hospitalization for C word like illness. I mean, it might be I guess it could be ADE, but it could also just be other viruses or other things, you know. BB308 says anything over 20 cycles creates false positives. That's pretty much true. That's pretty much true. But if you take the sample of all positives, it's basically 50% that are falling into the plus 20 category in the studies that I've seen. So it's not 97% false positive rate. It's like 50%. All right, so I'm gonna go to YouTube now and answer questions for you guys. Andre Bettinson has some angel waving emojis. Hi, Andre. Joe says, ciao, ciao. Highlander says, sup, Chris. Sup, Highlander. Highlander says he sent me stuff on Bitcoin on Instagram Messenger. I'll have to go through my message requests. But Bitcoin's doing well right now. So I'm happy I didn't sell it the last time it was 60K. Anyway, okay. Dylan Tracy says, do you have to get sick and show symptoms to have the natural? No, the studies that I reviewed were looking at anti-nucleocapsid antibodies in serum or positive nose tests. Avi says, "Hey Chris, 2 seconds of skimming and you've already got a false claim." Oh, this must be Avi from Twitter, who was waiting for my deranged rambling. Okay. So Avi says, Herder, I looked at the CIs and looks like there was a lot of overlap. So the Mr. Fuzzy and modern comparison, this paper may not be statistically significant, right? The test of significance with Mr. Fuzzy versus modern juicing in the CDC was for an assessment of effect modification. It was statistically significant. You need only read the paper to see that. Oh yeah, okay, that's true. That's true, but it's not a main point of mine at all. Okay, so I'm going to fix that in my article. All right, I remember them talking about that. They said in comparing characteristics between unjuiced adults with natural, between juiced and natural, wait, no, that's not the one. Effect modification by the juice product or by age group used p-value less than 0.2 for considering them indicative of statistically significant difference in the adjusted odds ratio. Okay, so I'll just, that's easy to fix. I'll just make it, the modern juice was more effective than the Mr. Fuzzy juice. And I think it's still true, though, that the association among Delta dominant period versus pre-Delta was not significant. So I think that's correct now. Avi says, and this is just with 2 seconds of skimming his ramblings. I have no idea what other false or misleading claims are in your ramblings. Well, I mean, it's not like you haven't made any mistakes in our discussions, Avi, and that was a minor one. So if there's something big, then tell me what it is. All right. Alan 2A1 says, great analysis, Chris. Thank you. Avi says, you realize my comments support modern and not Mr. Fuzzy, right? I don't know what he's talking about, but anyway, he thinks that the modern juice is the best one. I mean, there's an argument for that. It's got more durability than Mr. Fuzzy. And it outperforms for certain things. There are some studies that have shown it outperforming. Louise Noakes says, hi from lockdown in Auckland, New Zealand. Hi, I'm sorry you have to deal with that. She says they're looking at juicing our 5 to 11-year-old soon. Oh, we just got it approved and it's probably going to be mandated very broadly for school. It will definitely be mandated if the people of New York do not vote against the leading candidate tomorrow, by tomorrow, but tomorrow, because voting polls are closed now, but early voting's been open. So if you're in New York and you don't want school mandates for the juice, and you don't want, by the way, the first child who burned to death this weekend, the firefighters showed up to work and the boss said, you're not allowed here, go home. They literally showed up to work and were sent home in the jurisdiction where the child burned to death because there weren't enough firefighters this weekend. So what I'm saying is vote out the psychopaths tomorrow. All right. Highlander says we need to organize to take back our school boards locally too. Yeah, of course you do. One time when I was a substitute teacher in the high school that I dropped out of, there was a conspiracy against the principal because he stuck up for his legal authority when the superintendent was trying to get him to be a team player. And they had a fraudulent investigation of him and falsely accused him of changing his stepdaughter's grade so she could get into college in this investigation that was done by the finance minister of the school committee. I don't know why the finance minister is qualified to do that, but anyway, and so the school board, there's one silent person and 11 people that were fully on the side of the superintendent, and they were just constantly in your face about it. They knew hundreds of people were going to show up to the meeting, and so they had it in the school library so that only 50 people could fit in the room in a standing room audience, and everyone else had to be out in the hallway. That's how much they were raising their middle finger to us. And so we just ran a single issue campaign. There were half of the school committee was up that year and half the school committee was up the next year. Over the course of 2 years, we replaced every single person on the school committee on that one single issue. And local elections, no one votes in local elections. So all you have to do is turn out for a local election and you win it. So yeah, I mean, if you don't like what's going on in politics, you start with the local elections that you can actually win, starting with the school board, and you get rid of every single one of those people. Or you declare yourself independent from the school board, which would be my preference, but you should also vote out the school board. There's nothing is stopping you from homeschooling or inventing an alternative school structure and declaring independence from the regulatory bodies, and also campaigning to replace everyone on the school board. It's not mutually exclusive. Anyway, Highlander says the clowns are running everything. Correct. Carrie Burke says it's beyond belief. Correct. Skinamove says infuriating yet awesome material. I have some info I want to send you on L-arginine you did a while back. Where should I send it? Leave a comment on the L-arginine article, please. Deb B says he doesn't read the YouTube chat. Yeah, I do. I just do it at the end of presenting. You like our owl says, could it mean the C-like illness induced is an immune reaction and the virus is not detectable because the virus is destroyed by the immune system of a juice person by the time the nose? Yeah, I mean, that's possible. It could be a more intense immune reaction that causes the symptoms and gets rid of the virus in the nose. That seems like a very plausible scenario. That might sound like an ADE case, actually. I wonder what Malone thinks of this paper. I don't know if he's commented on it yet. Skinamove. There's so much stuff in the chat that I'm just going to cover stuff that's specifically about this study. A&H Yup says, has Chris ever talked about what's in the juice? I have not. AH Yup recommends Karen Kingston on that. I've not listened to her. How soon says you mean additives? Yeah, I haven't commented on that stuff. Chuggy Mug says, are they doing follow blood tests to see what the juice is actually doing to the sheep? I've seen numerous reports on hyperthyroidism in the form of Graves' disease post-juice. Yeah, I mean, they're doing those studies. I haven't looked at any of them because I've been focused on the transmission issue, but those studies exist. King Des says, strongly considering dropping out of college for the time being and pivoting career goals if legal assistance for admissions doesn't come through. I support declaring your independence and lawsuits at the same time. How soon says, what about the inactivated juice then? Well, I mean, this isn't it isn't about the inactivated juice, which isn't even available in the US. And this was an American study. I'm going to go to the Facebook chat. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe if you enjoy this content. And if you go to chrismasterjohnphd.com/support or chrismasterjohnphd.com/donate and kick something my way, it would mean the world to me. Scott Trahan on Facebook laughs at the Centers for You Know What. Well, I don't think saying the real word is in the algo yet, but I'm erring on the side of safety since my deplatforming on Instagram is imminent. In fact, I have a plot that I've gotten from studying the technology that Snowden used back in his whistleblowing days and that he endorses now to set up some alternatives that aren't traceable back to me, that everyone, all the humans will know is me, but the robots won't. So you'll see some of that soon. Joanne Roberts Caligari says, follow Cozy Wellness too. So I met Cozy. I met Cozy at the last protest that I was at, and we got a selfie up on Instagram, and he's a cool guy. And I guess he's been following my work since the Activator X days. So it's kind of cool figuring that out, because I've seen him I've seen him in some legal Zooms that I wound up crashing, and just in general in the protest movement. So Vic Badranath says, can you increase your volume? I mean, the gain on my mic is as good as it can get. I don't know if I wonder if Facebook's getting a different feed. It's all the way up on my computer, and I don't think Facebook is changing it. So, I mean, if the volume's not enough for you, I think you need to turn your volume up, because I can't get it any louder. Well, I could turn up the gain a little bit on my microphone system, but it would cause distortion to do that. Sarah Gallender says these code words are cracking me up. Well, I'm not doing it for fun. I'm doing it because my deplatforming on Instagram is imminent. But it winds up being funny, right? People laughing at various code words. Dan Fry said, dude, the paragraph before the conclusion is where the real conclusion is. The conclusion section is where the editor who's applying for the next grant makes stuff up to get more funding. So the second to last paragraph is the 7 limitations. Is that what you're getting at? I mean, there's limitations in every study. Dan Free says CT isn't the only story with PC with the nose test. You also need human DNA size as a control RNA. So check out Kevin McKinnon for details on this. I guess he's just drawing attention to another limitation of the nose test. Dan, I will post on the FDNY story, but you can find it at teachersforchoice.org. And I am going to post that. It's just that analyzing the study was higher priority. So I'll probably do it. It's 11:20 now. Maybe I'll do it tonight. Maybe I'll do it tomorrow. Vic, yes, the bottom line is that natural immunity is equal to or better than the juice for immunity. All right, that's all the question on Facebook. I'll do one last round through these, and then I gotta go. Just a reminder, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you want to throw something my way at chrismasterjohnphd.com/donate or chrismasterjohnphd.com/support, I'd love it, and it would mean the world to me. Just gonna check through the comments one last time to see if anything came in. VB308 says, thanks, Chris Hart. You're welcome. All right. That's the last round of questions on Instagram. I'll check YouTube real quick. All right, I think YouTube's all done, and I think Facebook is all done. All right, that's it. Please like, share, subscribe. Please throw something my way at chrismasterdunphd.com/support or chrismasterdunphd.com/donate. Thank you for all for being here and asking your questions. It was great doing the live, and I will see you guys later.